Hi, I'm Dan Pasternak. Today is February the 3rd, 2009, and we are in the Santa Monica offices of Studio Chief, Network Executive, and Digital Pioneer, Dean Valentine, and a man without whom this project, the Archive of American Television, would probably not exist. So we're going to enjoy some conversation and talk specifically about television with Mr. Dean Valentine. All right, well, I think you know how this goes. We're going to begin with just a little background information to get your personal history.
Okay.
What was your name at birth?
My name at birth was Dinu Sorin Valentine.
And when and where were you born?
I was born June 3rd, 1954 in Bucharest, Romania.
And where did you grow up?
Where I grew up 6 years in Bucharest, Romania, and my parents emigrated to Paris, and we spent a year in Paris, and then we went to St. Paul, Minnesota, and then we wound up in Queens, New York, which is where I sort of did the majority of my growing up until I went to school.
Now, that's some pretty dramatic changes of circumstances. How are your memories of that whole process? I mean, do you have a lot of memories of being in Romania or even in Paris?
Yeah, actually I do. I have a lot of, the normal childhood memories of Romania, but, in my case it was riding around in a little pedal car that had Khrushchev's picture on the side of it, and, it was a different time, and, Romania was a very, very backward, Eastern Europe at that whole time was a very, very backward place. I mean, people were still, obviously there were cars and everything else, but people were also still riding around in horse-drawn carriages, and people were still coming around sharpening knives. Itinerant knife sharpeners were coming around, and it was a very, very strange place, and nobody had a television set in my neck of the woods. So it was both very, very much a part of the 20th century and still very much a part of the 19th in some ways to sort of look back on it. But yeah, and Paris, sure, I have a lot of memories of Paris and St. Paul, Minnesota, and coming here just as Kennedy was president then, and my dad really, really wanted to go. I guess Kennedy came to St. Paul at some point in that period. My dad really, really wanted to go see him. It was really exciting for him, so yeah, I have a lot of memories.
So did you get to go and see Kennedy?
No, my dad went. My dad went at lunch. I guess it was like he was coming around. He was right around where my dad was working, and he went and saw him, and he came back and he was very, very excited. It was a big deal for him.
Now, talk a bit about your father. What was his name and what did he do?
His name was Abel Valentine. He was a journalist, and my family was a very prominent sort of commercial and intellectual family in Romania. My uncle, my great uncle rather, was one of the most prominent playwrights in the 20th century in Romania, who in classic Romanian absurdist fashion made it through the Holocaust, but got hit by a bus just as he was crossing the street right after the war, and the family sort of scattered to the winds after the before and after the Holocaust. But and my dad was a journalist. His dad was a shoe salesman and owned a shoe store in sort of the main Romanian shopping district, and. But when he left Romania, he was no longer a journalist. He didn't have the language skills, and he was already in his late 30s, and it's very hard to pick up a new language. So he did all sorts of sort of very classic immigrant story. He cut ties in Paris, and he was he worked in a restaurant for a while, and ultimately he wound up working at a publishing company in the order clerical, basically in New York City, but and then as a cab driver. So he never really regained the world that he left. So it was a very, very difficult road for them. But, yeah, that's what he was.
Now, how about your mother? What was her name and what did she do?
My mom's name is Rose. Her maiden name was Moskowitz, and she was she was also she worked at a newspaper as well in Romania, answering letters to the editor, and that's really. And when we came here at the United States, she worked at a bank, also in clerical in a loan department, which is what she did until she retired. Yeah, they were together. My dad passed away in 95. My mom's still very much alive in Forest Hills.
Now, you say your dad didn't have the language skills to continue his life as a journalist. How much English, excuse me, did they have when they came, and how much were they able to develop as new immigrants?
They had no English when they came. They spoke French fairly fluently because the Romania and France were sort of always tied at the hip culturally because of both Romance languages, but English not so much. But they both learned English. They both speak it. My dad spoke it very, very well, but never like a native speaker. Certainly in terms of accent, but just in terms of fluidity. Certainly from writing it was never as fluid for him as writing Romanian. And my mom speaks it very well also, but again, it's very different if you're not immigrating when you're younger than 8. It's never the brain isn't as fluid as it goes beyond that point.
Now, you yourself were younger than 8. Do you recall how that transition was for you?
I think it was difficult. I don't. Obviously, a lot of it's buried in the back of my memory, but I think it was fairly difficult because I spoke no English and I learned English in St. Paul, Minnesota. But it's much easier when you're younger than 8. But I think it must have been very difficult. To learn French and then English in the space of a year and a half. So.
Certainly no trace of an accent.
As I say, you can tell from the heavy Romanian accent, but I've been told I have a slight New York accent with a Midwest drawl underneath it, but I'm not really sure.
So, any siblings?
None.
What precipitated the move from Romania to France and then to the United States?
History, really. It was my parents had lived through the Holocaust and Romania after the war. Stalin closed his grip on Eastern Europe. It was during the time when Stalin himself was going through the various anti-Semitic purges that were going on, and so my parents had just had enough, and they a communist country with a totalitarian system, and they above all, I don't think it was so much for them. I don't think they wanted me to grow up there, and it was just a really, really hostile environment. So they applied to leave, and when you apply to leave, the process can take years, and in the meantime, they fired them from their jobs and everything else, and so it was very, very difficult for them. But they finally got permission in 60 or 61, and we're gone.
Okay, so now you're 6, 7, 8 years old. You come to the United States. Talk about the earliest impressions of American culture. You said you didn't have a television, so you said in Romania sort of no one in your neck of the woods had a television. Talk about the earliest impressions that you got of our culture and media, especially, because this is all so new and fresh and exciting. What kind of sparked your interest? Well,
in truth, I guess my earliest impressions of America are really tied up with television. They're really bound. First of all, because I think I was fairly isolated because I didn't speak the language at that point, so I was home a lot. And my father had bought his first TV because he'd made some money, and being able to watch, having a television house and being able to watch television was fantastic. So my memory of St. Paul, Minnesota in those days are completely intertwined with TV shows. With Mighty Mouse on Saturdays, with Superman, the George Reeves Superman on weekdays, and with various sort of local sort of puppet kid shows that they had on, with the game shows, Queen for a Day, which my grandmother used to really like, and I used to watch, and game shows especially, which I really, really liked, and so they're really, really tied up with that. In fact, I probably have more memories of TV. Whirly Birds, which was a early action show with 2 guys in a helicopter chasing people, and the westerns that were on at the time, Lone Ranger, I mean, they're on, obviously, Three Stooges. I mean, because that was all the stuff that was being regurgitated in the kiddie portion of the day part. But so my memories are really, really tied up with that, much more than they are with any kids or anything else. And so I think television is really very much a part of my transition to America. It's really part of it sort of forms the baseline of my immigrant experience, my 8-year-old immigrant experience.
But also the language, I guess, being new to you, I mean, that may very well have played into the development of your language as well.
I'm sure it did. I'm sure it played an enormous part in learning English. And I'm sure school did a lot of that as well, but it did. And it's always easier to understand things when you're enjoying the entertainment. So yeah.
So any even just inclinations at that point that this thing that obviously captured your imagination at that point could be a destiny for you in some fashion?
Oh no. I hadn't. I wish I'd thought of it at that point. Probably would have gotten to it earlier, but no. It was just the entertainment. It was just entertainment. I never really. It was many years before I'm not sure I ever really did think about what it is I wanted to do in any sort of formal sense.
So you sort of, if someone were to have posed the question to you, what do you want to be when you grow up? Do you think you had any vision for what your life was going to be?
I think I probably would have said engineer or something like that. I think that's what I wanted to. I wanted to build things when I was little, or I wouldn't have minded being Superman either. But it was we were running out of towels, so that was that was probably not going to happen.
So, what high school did you attend?
I attended Bronx High School of Science in New York, and I went to school and then University of Chicago.
And how was that? What kind of student were you?
Well, yeah, I was a pretty good student. I mean, you had to be a pretty good student to get into Bronx High School of Science anyway. You had to take a test, and hundreds of thousands of kids took the test, and only about 1,000 or 2,000 a year made it into the high school. It was a public high school that was phenomenal education. I mean, it was one of the great. It was one of the crowning achievements of the New York City educational system was Bronx High School of Science, and I was very lucky to go there. And it was even though I went to a great university, it was a couple of years into the university before I was learning stuff that I hadn't already learned at Bronx High School of Science. It was, wow. But it was a long haul from Queens. If you know the geography of New York, from Queens to northern Bronx was a long haul, and it was like the Warriors. You felt like you were going to get beat up by somebody somewhere along the route. And DeWitt Clinton, which was the local school, which was filled with these incredibly, in the 60s, incredibly enraged black kids. They'd sit there and just wait outside Bronx Science with like little teeny Jewish kids would keep coming out and just, beat the crap out of us on a continuing basis. But it was worth it.
My dad was one of those Jewish kids who was in the minority at DeWitt Clinton.
Yeah, he must have been like the only one. I don't remember. Well, that was probably older than
just prior, but it was beginning when DeWitt Clinton was I think starting to transition with a lot more of the black kids that were coming down from Harlem.
Right, that's right. Yeah. By '68, it was already pretty far gone.
But quite a cultural expanse that you've traversed just at this point in your life.
It gave me a lot of perspective, and it's continued to give it to me, I guess. Just in my, I tend to have a fairly broad view of things, and I suspect that, all those radical cultural shifts early on had a lot to do with it.
Well, it's also a fascinating point in our history as a country as well to be present for, and to have come from a communist country, and now in all sort of the upheaval of the late '60s in America, and then being at that part of New York, and then of course Chicago, which was a hotbed of awareness and activity. How was that for you, Chicago?
Well, Chicago was a couple of years after I went to college in '72, mm-hmm. And by that point the troublemakers at the University of Chicago had already been kicked out by Ed Levy, who went on to become Attorney General under I don't remember if it was under Reagan or Carter, but a lot of it was already quieting down. The 70s had already, by the time I got there, the 70s had really begun. Chicago was very, very active. I'm sure in the late '60s. But by the time I got there, people were really sort of starting to focus back on work and career and making money, and also the '73 was the beginning of the oil embargo and the oil shocks that really radically that's what really ended the '60s as far as I'm concerned. And all of a sudden, people were really, really worried about how they're going to make a living, and unemployment was going up. So it's very different.
So, okay, you're at the University of Chicago. What are you studying?
English. I mean, I wasn't studying anything in particular. University of Chicago had a very strong belief in a Common Core curriculum, and so the first couple of years, you don't really study anything except you study everything, and it's very much philosophy and sociology and biology and economics and all that kind of stuff.
So what did you have any sense of what your destiny was going to be at this point?
Well, by that time I was already pretty deep into writing and into I'd become really, really interested in, when I was in high school, my high school English teacher was a man named Mark Rifkin, who sadly, as I discovered many years later, passed away from AIDS. Really, really influenced me in reading, and I started reading with a completely different understanding of how to read, and it was Shakespeare in particular, but it really changed my life, because I went from being, wanting to go into engineering and all that kind of stuff to being really interested in literature, and I started writing poetry, and so that was really my great passion at the time, and continued to be throughout my days at the University of Chicago. And that's really what I focused on, was that.
How did your father feel about that?
He was mildly supportive, I guess I would say. He was he was a journalist. It wasn't, the usual Jewish immigrant story is be a lawyer, a doctor, or don't come home. But he had a slightly broader perspective. He came from a slightly different kind of family.
That's sort of why I asked. I thought it's sort of interesting that, having been a journalist and obviously probably having a passion for writing back in Romania, and then not being able to continue that, would that have been at all bittersweet, or was there a sense of pride that you were sort of maybe picking up and fulfilling some of the promise for him?
Yeah, I think maybe there was. I wasn't really much of a journalist at the time, but yeah, I think there was. We came from a literary family, and I think he in his gut, I think he responded to that and felt good about it. I think he would have preferred that I chosen something more stable, where, in their minds they had constant anxiety because so much was taken away from them, and in their minds, being a doctor would make you safe no matter who had power. So they would have been much happier if I'd been a doctor, but they weren't unsupportive or for the most part. But like I said, they'd prefer something else. I was clear about that, but it wasn't like, if you don't go into medical school, if you don't do that, we're going to cut off supporting you or anything. So
then what was your first job? What was your first work out of college?
My first work out of college was as a night clerk because professional poetry positions were few and far between. Was as a night clerk at the Hotel Esplanade on 74th and West End Avenue in New York, and where I manned the switchboard, which in those days was still one of those rickety old manual switchboards. Just pull stuff out and plug it in, and that's really what I did. It was a residential hotel, so it wasn't like I was checking in hookers and stuff, but they weren't too far away.
You say at night, so what were your hours?
1 o'clock to 9.
Did you choose that, or was that what was available?
That's what was available. Available, and it was also late in '76. It was still a pretty hard time. It was hard to find something in the time, basically journalistic and literary organizations, and it took a while.
So when did writing start to take over and pay the bills for you?
Writing never really paid the bills. By that point, I'd started writing theater criticism, and because it was a cheap way to get a date. I couldn't really afford the real deal. But if I wrote a few 100-word essay, I'd get free tickets. So it was, so I started doing that, and I was writing for Our Town and for Soho Weekly and a bunch of other local papers, and it didn't pay the bills, but it paid for the entertainment for the girls. So that was, it did its job.
That's a good deal.
Yeah. So.
Now, you started doing some work for Life magazine, though, correct?
I got a job at Life in 1979. I'd had a couple of jobs before then. My first job was at a small publication called The New Leader, which was like the New Republic, except less so. The New Leader actually was founded by Mensheviks, by guys who emigrated from Russia in the 1920s and were part of the AFL-CIO labor movement. And it was a fairly prominent journal, along with the New Republic, for many years, but it had started falling into disrepair by the time I got there. But it was sort of entertaining, and I learned a lot about journalism and about editing and about working with writers, and I really learned how to be an editor, and which I liked, and that really became my profession, was editorial, and I did that for about a year and a half, and then I went to the Saturday Review of Literature, which I did for a year, and then I got a job in the magazine development group at Time Inc., which was the think tank where they theoretically launched new magazines, but by that point, Time Inc. had so kind of run out of corporate energy, and the guy running it at the time, was just so unexceptionally uninteresting that it was really the place itself was not a hotbed of excitement. But I spent about a year there, and I tried launching a magazine we called Then and Now, which was a sort of pop nostalgia magazine, because we had huge archives. Time Inc. had amazing photo archives between Life and Fortune and all of its various amazing photography, and it seemed to me like a really great way to use the library. And also seemed that it was a moment in history where the people's interests were sort of turning backward in a interesting way, but it just never got off the ground. It did nothing from that period for anybody. And I went to Life magazine as I was invited to go there as an editor, as articles editor of Life, and I did that for a number of years.
So then, now talk about how you made the transition into television. Was it something that you were sort of keen on for a while, or sort of how did that come about?
No, it was semi-accidental. I'd always loved television, obviously, and it's I watch television. I like television. I got television in some visceral way, but no, it came about really through a friend whose name was Scott Coffer, who was a journalist with me in New York, and I had hired him at a magazine that I was working at, and we'd become really good friends. And Scott, who came from here originally from Los Angeles, hated New York and lived for the day he could come back to LA. And after a couple of years, finally knocking around New York, finally got a job at California Magazine or whatever. I think that's what it was at the time, or LA, Los Angeles Magazine. I don't remember which one. And did that for about a year and a half, and organized what became subsequently a very famous softball game out here, where a lot of journalists and industry guys played softball. And while he was in one of these softball games, he met Brandon Tartikoff and a guy named Larry Little, who was running Warner Brothers, and he eventually was offered a job as a VP of comedy development at Warner Brothers, and he began working in the the TV biz. And I came out here to visit him once when I was covering a story, and I think the story, I don't remember what the story was, but I think it was about a guy who was launching a mechanical pterodactyl in Death Valley, a guy named Paul McCready, who was actually an aviation genius from Caltech, but I was sent out here to cover it, and I stayed with Scott in his apartment. And when I stayed with him, I would go to work with him every once in a while, and and go on the set, and I kind of fell in love with it. It was like just walking onto a set and sort of the excitement of it, and the whole process of filming it and reshooting, and the combination of theater, which I'd always been interested in and was writing about, and and the glamour. I won't say exactly the glamour of it, but the excitement of it, because the glamour was never particularly appealing. But the excitement of it, and with TV particularly, the sort of journalism quality, the dailiness of it, the it's not like a movie. Movies are much more like Foreign Affairs Quarterly. The TV is like, it's a working guy's medium, and so I like the people that I'd met who were in it. They struck me as like incredibly smart and different than what I had thought they were going to be.
Do you remember what the set was?
It was, I think it was Head of the Class, if I remember right.
So it was a multicam sitcom.
Yeah, it was a multiple camera sitcom. Yeah,
so around what year would this have been?
80, I don't know, somewhere around 85, I think. Yeah, 85, 86, somewhere in there.
All right, so that got you kind of excited. Then
it got me kind of excited, and then I kept Brandon and I sort of met. Tartikoff and I met playing softball and at one of these games, and I got along with him, and he liked journalists, and I liked him, and he was an incredibly witty, charming guy, and we kind of hit it off, and we spoke a few times on the phone, and then I saw him and a bunch of other guys when they came in for the upfronts in New York, and I don't know, a couple of months later, called me up and offered me. I came out. He called me up and said, "I want you to come out and interview," and he gave me some scripts, and I read the scripts. I don't remember what they were. I guess it was some pilots. Yeah, Tortelli's, some stuff they were doing at Tortelli's and Alf, and some I can't remember what else. And so I came out. I interviewed with him, with Perry Simon, with Michelle Bruston, with Warren Littlefield, and they offered me a job, and that was hard to say no to, so I took it.
Well, let's focus for a second on Brandon, because obviously, in the history of television, one of the great figures, and certainly in terms of programming. Just describe him personally and professionally.
He was an incredibly charismatic guy, very self-confident. Very funny, exceptionally, really, really witty, very cutting. Not a kind sense of humor by any stretch, and not a kind person often in his corporate life. He really belittled. He had very low tolerance for idiots, and at any point anybody can be an idiot. So it could be pretty nasty, but very loved television, loved the feeling of television, loved the process of it, loved looking at funny people and thinking they could be TV stars, loved thinking about how the audience would respond, loved coming up with goofy TV-ish ideas and angles on them. He was really a brilliant. He wasn't brilliant creatively in a traditional sense. He was a brilliant marketer. He would really think about how to package something and sell it. Began when he was at WGN, I think, which is where he started in Chicago. And he came up with Gorilla, Gorilla My Dreams. These kind of ways of packaging afternoon movies and finding great ways to sell them. So he was a true TV kid. He came out of the medium; it was his language, and he spoke it fluently. But he was intimidating. He could be really cold. Sometimes he had these very hooded eyes, and just kind of, and he sort of narrowed them if he didn't like what was going on, and it could be pretty scary. People, particularly Warren Littlefield and the VPs, lived in a mortal terror of him and of his disapproval, so it was a very NBC was a terrible environment, and the environment as a result, the environment he created at NBC that was created around him because of he wasn't a strong administrator, and he wasn't because really what he loved was the creative side of television. He didn't really love running
a business,
an organization. There's no part of Brandon that responded to that in the least. There was nothing about him that, if you knew him well, there was nothing about him that was a businessman. He didn't like business people, ultimately. He didn't care about them. He'd much rather hang out with a bunch of writers and at a desk coming up with jokes. Brandon was at his core a writer, or a wannabe writer, and that's, or wannabe sitcom producer, and he wasn't that, and you know, because he didn't really know how to lead a business, and because he wasn't a strong leader, in my opinion, in retrospect, in that way. He was great at being Brandon, but it left NBC as a highly politicized. Unlike Grant Tinker, who came before him, who left just as I was coming in, Grant may not have been a creative genius. I don't really know. I never really knew him, but he was a wonderful sort of figure and brought people together and really moved the organization forward. And Brandon had none of that, and as a result, he had an organization that was highly dysfunctional, highly politicized, and really worked against him in many, many ways, because the people, you know, when there's a power vacuum in those kinds of ways, you know, the Stalin-like figures tend to occupy the space, and that's what happened to him. People who were very political, but who had their own agendas, really got much more active. So NBC couldn't have been more dysfunctional and horrible as a place to work. So I was there for a year and a half, and I have to say that I probably hated that job more than any job I've ever had, including the night watchman job, or the night desk clerk job, which I really didn't like.
Wow, that's saying something.
But it was just a dreadful, dreadful place.
So now Brandon was president of NBC at the time. Yeah. Obviously, what you're describing is the environment, but talk about the state of NBC at this moment in their history, and sort of what the schedule looked like and what space it occupied in the network world.
Well, NBC at the time was amazing, because NBC at the time was running on, had really the last booster of the rocket had fired and was going up, 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 up. I mean, the Cosby Show on the day that I started, I think, which was a summer, so it was a midsummer repeat, I think was doing a 53 share. So NBC at the time was, because of Brandon's programming genius, NBC had the Cosby Show, and it had that Thursday night that it lived on for decades. And, you know, to some extent, it's still trying now, but it had the Cosby Show. It had Family Ties. It had I'm trying to remember what else it had. Night Court, and Cheers. Hill Street Blues was still there, I think. Its schedule was just a powerhouse on almost every night. Golden Girls was kicking, but they had opened up Saturday night now as a result of Golden Girls. So Golden Girls was doing amazing things on Saturday for them. It was just it was the height that year, 1986 or 87, was the very, very, very apogee of their life as a network. They were never to be that good again, and they were never that good until then. But it was the height of network television. You know, Fox had just launched. So it was the last year, really, of the three network TV world.
It's an interesting time to be coming into the television business.
I didn't know it, but yeah, it was, and that it was all sort of really about to change. But yeah, it was an amazing. It was, and of course the tremendous success that it was having really exacerbated all the political issues within the company. So the more successful they were, the crazier the place got, and let's also not forget that it was the last year of the cocaine sniffing part of the Hollywood existence. So there was drugs it was dying down because of the Len Bias thing, but drugs were still part of the culture of Hollywood at that time.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of sort of Len Bias as sort of the dividing line at the end of that era, but that's
he was. I mean, that was the dividing line, and it started dying down, but there were still and by '88 it was just really not cool.
So now talk about your position and some of your responsibilities and some of the shows you worked on.
Well, when I started, I started in the comedy development, and we were trying to remember what we were developing at the time.
So were you reporting to Perry or to Warren at that point?
And I was reporting to Michelle Bruston, who had traded jobs with Perry. She was head of drama, and he was head of comedy. and they had traded jobs, and she was head of Now Comedy, and we just worked on a whole bunch of. I'm trying. I probably, if I had like 5 minutes, I'd probably remember. But the only thing I'm really sure of is that nothing that we worked on was any good, and none of it really made it to air. And I was only there for one season before I managed to get out. But they're all pretty bad. They're all pretty bad comedies. And Brandon had a weakness for sort of the high concept, and without somebody, Perry was fairly strong. Was a fairly strong executive and would challenge him a lot. Michelle, because she was new to that area, didn't know enough to challenge Brandon. So Brandon's worst instincts, which could be really bad, like with anybody. So I just remember we did just like a lot of really, really bad high concept comedies. And by the way, I have a fairly strong taste for those myself. So I was not the one to raise my voice, but I just remember that none of them, 6 kids in a Catholic girls' school. It was like stuff like that, and and one was worse than the next. So none of them made it on, and after that, I worked in the current department, overseeing shows, and that's really where I learned. That's really where I learned most of what I know about television, because we
talk about that. Talk about what the difference is between being in development and current, and what skills you feel you developed in sort of the respective areas.
Well, current television, NBC had a very strong belief that executives should do both. And because you really learned to understand how television's made and why it works, it doesn't work, you need to understand the process of its making. And because it's not really just about a good idea. A movie can be just about a good idea because all you're really selling is ultimately the idea and the star. And television is a little bit different because you have to sell a long-term relationship to a piece of television, to a viewer, 100 times. And why am I going to come back to the 38th or 40th or 50th episode of a show? And that's really about execution. So television was always about a medium of execution, not so much a medium of just about marketing. And so therefore, who the producers were, who executed that show on a week-to-week basis, was always the hallmark of television. And that's why TV networks went to such great lengths to make long-term deals with people that they trusted to make television shows. And the pedigree for that was also really important. That the guys, there was very much an apprenticeship system. The guys who learned it you really had to spend 4, 5, 6 years on the staff of a television show to know how to execute your own. And so there was a great premium paid to people who stayed for a long period of time with the show. So at that time, first of all, there weren't that many places to move to, but for producers and writers, they would stay on a show for 3, 4, 5 years. The Charles brothers stayed with Jim Brooks on Taxi for 5 years. They were the show, and by that time they learned how to run a show, what all the pieces were, how to deal with actors, how to write a script, how to cut a script, how to deal with a network, how to make all these pieces move together. And that process, which they learned from the producer side, as an executive, you learn from the current side. And it was a great privilege because even though you were a 20-something-year-old punk, you got to sit there with Jim Brooks or the Charles brothers or anybody else and having to give them notes and which often was charged process for exactly that reason. But you learned an enormous amount. And
did you cover? Was Cheers one of the shows you covered?
I did, but I have to say I never gave a single note. I was
too intimidated.
It wasn't that I was intimidated. It was just that the show they were great, and I never came up with a better joke, and I never came up with a better fix to an Act 2 problem than they did. And my feeling was, if you're not better, you should probably just shut up. And
by the way, that's great advice to give executives, because sometimes if it ain't broke, don't fix it is a great rule to go by.
Well, the really great writers, the great producers, though, there was really, you could go through a Reinhold Wigge, who was the guy who was the executive producer of Night Court, who left the business after he made tons of money, went back to Chicago and lived a perfectly nice life. You looked at their scripts and you couldn't think of notes to give them because they were so perfectly structured. And it was mostly about structure, ultimately. It's very, very hard to tell a coherent character story that has a beginning, middle, and end, and a 24-minute, at that time it was 25-minute arc. And people who did it well were really, they were kind of geniuses. And Charles Brothers were phenomenal, and so were a number of other people, Gary David Goldberg, and so they were very, very strong. NBC, the reason NBC was so successful is it had the best writers. It was just that simple. It had, Brandon had successfully identified who they wanted to be in business with. They'd made that commitment, and it paid off.
So I would think at that point, well, Cosby, as you said, was an established hit show. I think Family Ties had come before Cosby. Cheers had started, at least in the ratings, not as strong, but...
By that point it was growing. By that point it was pretty big.
So, and then Night Court. So were there any other shows that you can think of that you worked on that were more at those early stages that felt like they needed some help and direction from the network that you were sort of privy to?
Oh yeah. No, I was. That was a good part of my job. The bad part of my job was covering 227, and with Marla Gibbs and the what were known as the embassy shows. It was the end part of the Norman Lear empire that was, at that point creatively was long past its prime. But they had these terrible, terrible shows, which NBC did pretty well with. They were horrible. and it was
how
my job
involved
to
was
cover them.
Lear?
No, Norman wasn't involved at all at that point. I think he'd already sold.
Okay.
They'd been sold to Columbia or whatever. I think they were Columbia shows at that point.
Okay.
Embassy I think was sold to Columbia like 2 or 3 years before. Okay. But it was those shows that sort of grew out of that. You could all trace it back. Marla Gibbs, you could trace back to the Jeffersons. It was all sort of where the genealogy led. Right. But it was. The shows were terrible. Giving notes on them was terrible. They were all run by these kind of very, I won't say hacked out, but very tired producers who the last thing they wanted was some kid from the network coming in and saying, I think the Act 2 break needs some work, and and why can't we have more Jack Hay instead of more Marla Gibbs, and and it just all they really wanted to do was take a gun and shoot you if they could have, but it wasn't legal. So those were very, but oddly enough, learned more from those shows because you learned really what not to do, and those were equally valuable. So yeah, but that was I spent a lot more time covering those shows than on Cheers.
So now, I have a sense just based on your description of the environment, but talk about why you left NBC and what you did next.
I never fit into NBC. I mean, I love Brandon. We stayed friends for many, many years, but I didn't like being there, and I didn't fit in, and I never really worked well in those kind of very corporatized environments and very politicized environments, and I started just looking for something else to do because I had no money, and I knew I couldn't stay there, and I didn't want to go back to journalism, and at around that time, I don't remember who told me about it, but somebody said, there's a job at Disney, and Disney at that point was a absolute non-factor in television. Obviously, it was revived and being renewed by Eisner and Katzenberg in features and in the theme parks and many, many other areas, but in television, it had been absolutely no impact. There were no Disney shows on air. There was nothing. And they were looking for somebody in the comedy department at director level and entry level, I guess, or something like that. And I went and I met with the guys who were running the TV department at the time. Was a guy named Grant Rosenberg, and his deputy was a guy named Tony Jonas, who went on to be an executive at Warner Brothers for many years, and he was a really good guy. And they offered me a job, and I said, well, what is it? You guys don't have any shows on air. There's like nothing. And I said, you don't have deals with any writers, but no, we really want to succeed, and we need somebody. And, and I guess nobody was that enthusiastic about working there. And I kind of was. And I took the job. And I didn't have much choice, to be honest with you, because there was like the best. It was the best of whatever was out there. And I really wanted to leave NBC. I went. It was a very lucky thing.
So they had no shows on the primetime schedule.
Nothing.
And they had you said no overall deals?
Uh, I've had some overall deals that were just all busts, and a lot of them were in the 1 hour. Grant Rosenberg had come out of the 1 hour television world at MGM or whatever. I don't remember where he was before. And so a lot of their deals were for 1 hour. Joel Surnow, who went on to create 24, was a deal that they had. They got him. Gil Grant was Chris Carter, who went on to create. But at the time, they didn't want to be, Disney didn't want to be in the 1 hour business. And they'd had no luck in the half hour business. So that's
And of course, your charge was half hour.
my charge was half hour. That's right.
All right.
Yeah.
So now, to whom were you reporting at that
To
point?
Tony Jonas.
And what was sort of your charge? I mean, you come in, it's like, okay, get some half-hour shows on the air. What do you do?
We didn't do much. We didn't have any money, and we didn't have any writers. So it's no money, no writers is a bad recipe for television, for network television, just in general. And and I was fairly low level enough that it wasn't up to me to get that done. But I think after a year, because there were still no comedies on and still no success, I think Eisner, they brought in Randy Reese, a guy named Randy Reese, to run the division, who was a syndication sales guy. And Randy, who knew nothing about creative, but at least knew that he wanted to do well, and I guess the first thing he did was he started firing. I guess he fired Grant, and then Tony took his job, and it just created all this turmoil. But the real problem in the end was that they still weren't allocating money. And until that changed, which it did change after about a year and a half, at some point Jeffrey Katzenberg and Eisner realized that that we were in a very, very competitive environment, that to get the writers that the networks wanted to be in business with required a substantial investment of money, that there was no free way of doing it, that it wasn't about just coming up with a fun idea, which was Eisner's inclination always, that they had to make that investment. And they finally made that. They finally came to and Randy pushed them that way as well, and Rich Frank, and they finally came to the conclusion they set aside a couple $100 million to make writer deals. And when that happened, I had most of the relationships, and so we started making deals. And
now, was this then the creation of Touchstone Television at this point, or?
Yeah, sort of around then. And Garth Ancier was brought in. I guess they fired Randy. Randy fired Grant and then Tony Jonas, and so that regime was gone. And they brought in Garth Ancier to be the head of the TV studio, and they promoted me, and underneath him, and that sort of was Touchstone Television, and that went on for about, and we started making some writer deals, and some pretty, we made deals with Matt Williams and a whole bunch of guys, and Michael Jacobs, and we started doing Dinosaurs at the time. Just got very, very active because we had money to do our job.
Let's talk about a few of these writers. I mean, Matt Williams. I mean, talk about, you probably couldn't have had a stronger pedigree at that moment in TV history. Sort of just talk about who he was as a guy and as a writer and his resume when you pulled him in and made a deal with him.
Well, I didn't know him personally, but I was a great admirer of Roseanne, and I thought it was a great show, and really was my kind of show. It was very much about real people. It was character comedy. I thought she was phenomenal. I didn't know any of the backstory about her as a person or anything else, but clearly whoever wrote that show had an authentic voice, and was writing from a real knowledge of lower middle class America and working class America, and I really responded to that. And he was my first. To me, he was like the guy. He was the guy. Really, there were two people I really wanted to make deals with. One was Angel, Casey, and Lee, who were working at Cheers, who I knew were brilliant writers, and I had tremendous respect for what they did. And I chased them for a year, and ultimately we weren't able to overcome what NBC was willing to give them and what Paramount was willing to give them. But Matt was a little bit different story, and we met him, and Jeffrey Katzenberg met him and really liked him as well. And if you know Jeffrey at all, he's a tenacious guy, so he made it his own business. It wasn't just up to me. He made it his own business to go land Matt Williams, who a lot of people were trying to make deals with at the time. And finally, he between the relationship that we developed with him and the fact that Jeffrey was willing to put up the money, it's So what is it you want? And the agent named a number, and Jeffrey said done, and sent over the contract basically that day.
Wow.
So it was that was sort of the keystone deal to Touchstone, and and Matt and I, we got along great from the very, very beginning because I respected what he was doing immensely, and the reality of what he was doing. Michael Jacobs was a very different thing. Michael, I knew Michael from my two dads at NBC, which he was doing at the time, and as I said, I'd always had a soft spot for sort of high concept, goofy Friday night type comedy, and Michael was and Michael also came from the playwriting world, and that's what he wanted to write, and I felt very strongly that Disney needed to be in that business, and he was a very entertaining little Jewish guy, very hyper, and basically could have been an agent in another life, but happened to be a pretty good writer, and very, very entrepreneurial, very aggressive. Really wanted to become like a Miller Boyette. He wanted to have a building on Sunset Boulevard. That's really what he wanted. And we made a deal with Michael. Michael we did Dinosaurs, which was really the first sort of major thing I worked on at Disney. Was an idea that Henson wanted to do, and that I don't remember if I came up with it or they come up with it, but it was sort of dealing with environmental degradation from a comedic viewpoint. And we wanted to do these from the standpoint of somebody who'd become extinct, which were dinosaurs who managed to somehow use up all their resources and go away. But anyway, we wanted to do it as a comedy. So,
but talk about a high concept comedy to sell to prime time.
It was a high concept comedy, and obviously if we were doing it now, it's funny because at the time it was probably the most expensive TV show ever done, because you had to build these massive puppets with telemetry and with radio controlled, and then one guy in the puppet, one guy controlling the eyes, another guy controlling the facial muscles. There's like 5 guys working this like massive puppet, and to try to get comedy out of it, and to build these sets that went on for miles. It's very, very expensive. And now, of course, if we were doing it, we'd be doing it CGI at 1/10 the price, and probably would have done much better. But it was incredibly entertaining. It was really, really interesting. And Michael did that show for us, and we developed a good relationship with him and kept him. So there were a bunch of other guys too, but those were, in my view, those were sort of the key. It was some guy to develop sort of more 9 o'clock, slightly more adult shows, and somebody to develop more kid-oriented family programming. That those would be the building blocks on which we'd build Touchstone, and that's what it was.
Now, it's sort of an interesting point. You say Dinosaurs was one of the first shows that you worked on that you took out and sold. At this point, talk about the difference about being on the network side as a buyer and being on the studio side as a seller. There's very different kind of disciplines there.
Yeah, I mean, at some level, yes and no. They're both ultimately the same. I've always felt that everybody in Hollywood has exactly the same job. They just call it different things. And everybody's job is to package together ideas and talent and market them. And that job is the same whether you're an agent or a studio executive or a writer in Hollywood or a buyer or seller. And so I don't really think they're fundamentally different. They draw on different skills though, because as to sell to a network, you have to put on a very different kind of hat than to buy. Because to sell, you're in salesman mode. You're giving people reasons to buy this thing. And if you're a seller, if you're a buyer, all you're thinking about is like, is this going to make my network look really bad? Is it going to fail? Is it going to succeed? How does it fit in with? You're looking at a much broader strategic picture. When you're a seller, you're not looking at any strategic picture. You're looking at like closing the deal with that guy that day, right now, period. It's one little focus. When you're a buyer, you're looking at your schedule. You're looking at the evolution of the business. You're looking at advertisers, how they're going to respond to it. If the audience, can you sell it? How much is it going to cost you to sell it? How does it fit? Where does it fit in on your schedule? Very, very much more strategic. Many more strategic considerations go in than simply your own passion for the show, and that's always the balance of being a buyer. And it's not something that the seller has to think about or should think about. Really, they should think about getting that show sold. Period.
And the other thing probably worth noting just at this moment in television history, is that this is still at a time where your studio was not yet specifically aligned with a specific network.
That's right. We were selling to everybody, and we were designing ourselves to be able to sell to everybody. There was no, at that point, there were no studios that owned.
There was no vertical integration.
There was no vertical integration yet, and so of course that was going to change. But yeah.
One little sort of off ramp I wanted to take, just because we have it noted here, is the studio had this relationship with Whit Thomas. Talk about your involvement with Golden Girls, Empty Nest, Blossom, the Whit Thomas shows that were part of that empire at that time.
I knew I knew Paul and Tony from NBC. I covered Golden Girls, actually. It was one of the shows I covered as a current exec, and they were at first blush they were very haughty guys. They didn't take well to network executives. And I subsequently found out they're very strategic about that, because they really wanted to. They liked beating up the network because they felt that they would get much better time periods and everything else. So they were actually great guys, both of them, and I wound up being very close friends, or not close, but I wound up being really good friends with both of them over the years. But they were tough, and they were very protective of Susan, who was the writer. Paul and Tony were non-writing producers, which is an anomaly at the time. There were a few, but not many. And it was Susan who was the writer. Susan was a very fragile human being in many, many ways. She didn't like
Susan Harris.
Susan Harris. She didn't like, who was Paul's wife. She didn't like dealing with the network thing. She didn't want to deal with anything. All she wanted to do was write, and write scripts and raise her children. And so that made it they were protective of her, as I subsequently realized. So Golden Girls I had no involvement with. It was already going on by the time I got there. But Blossom and Empty Nest were developed under my time, and it was a very happy development process for both. I mean, these were guys who were the ultimate professionals, and their shop was a wholly professional shop, and they prided themselves rightly on it. So there wasn't really very much that one could say to them other than the script sucks or it doesn't suck, and that's not a productive conversation to have. I remember giving them some notes on Empty Nest and some notes on Blossom, which Blossom particularly I had a lot of issues with in the writing, but I thought she was phenomenal, and I was pretty sure the show would work. So ultimately, I just thought the best thing to do was just be supportive and with the network and try to clear as much brush for the show as possible, and that's really what my job was for that. I didn't feel that I had much to add.
But did you have a hand, as I would imagine you would, in some of the elements like the casting? And...
Oh yeah, no, we had a hand in it. I mean, we were involved in. I was involved in all those. I was involved in all those things, but
because I believe Mayim Bialik had been in Beaches, and which was a touchstone.
Mayim was in Beaches, and I don't remember how she. I don't remember what the exact pathway was to Paul and Tony, but we had I think we had a holding deal with her because we liked her. I don't remember if I made the deal or Jeffrey pushed us to make the deal. That's kind of, it's a blur to me. But I think we had the holding deal with her, or we made the holding deal with her, and then we got Paul and Tony involved, and they had Don Rio who really liked it. And some of these packages, it's hard to remember how the pieces came together. But no, we were completely involved in the casting and in everything else. It's just the normal course of business. Just in terms of my own impact on it, I don't think I did very much other than the normal studio, this normal studio support. They were such a coherent professional shop. They had a whole infrastructure. They didn't, whether we were there or not, would have made no difference. You could have erased all of Disney television. That show would have still happened, and Empty Nest would have still happened. They were their own studio, really. Whereas that's not the case for Matt Williams, who was basically just a writer and a guy who needed an infrastructure, needed the studio support in a different way, or Michael Jacobs.
All right.